Do you know that China has the second largest economy in the world? Over the decades, China has self-developed into a powerhouse to be reckoned with. What does this mean for the rest of the world? How has China managed to evolve into a force to reckon with? What steps are they taking to ensure they keep evolving? What's China's effect on the world? In this video, we're going to examine China's effect on the world and the impact of a prolonged China slowdown. Let's go. The rise of China into the upper echelons of the world economic order underscores the sway it has over how the global economy performs from the perspective of its appetite for commodities from grains to energy to metals. Not long ago, China was viewed primarily as a regional actor with a predominant focus on events in its near abroad. In the span of a few short decades, China has established itself as a global actor. It has solidified its role as one of a small handful of countries with interests spanning the globe and the capacity to act on them. China's presence is now felt in every corner of the world, from the South Pacific to South and Central Asia, the wider Middle East, Latin America, and points in between. China's economy has enjoyed 30 years of explosive growth, making it one of the largest. This success is based on a mixed economy that incorporated limited capitalism within a command economy. Why has this economy thrived and developed rapidly? China fueled its former spectacular growth with massive government spending. The government owns strategically important companies that dominate their industries. It controls the big three energy companies, PetroChina, Sinopec, and the China National Offshore Oil Corporation, CNOOC. Government ownership allowed China to direct the companies to high-priority projects. China requires several things of foreign companies who want to do business in China or work with Chinese companies. One is that they often must share their technology. Chinese companies use this knowledge to make the products themselves. The People's Bank of China, the national's central bank, tightly controls the yen to dollar value. It does this to manage the prices of exports to the United States. It wants them to be a little cheaper than those produced in America. It can achieve this because China's cost of living is lower than the developed world. By managing its exchange rate, China can take advantage of this disparity. Through its economic explosion and exponential development, China has had its effects on the world positively and in not so good ways. Let's look at them. Advantages. China's growth has reduced poverty. Only 3.3% of the population lives below the poverty line. China contains about 20% of the world's population. As its people get richer, they will consume more. Companies will try to sell to this market, the largest in the world, and tailor their products to Chinese tastes. Growth is making China a world economic leader. China is now the world's biggest producer of aluminum and steel. Chinese tech companies quickly became market leaders. Huawei is the world's top telecommunications equipment maker, and it's quickly becoming the world leader in developing 5G technology. Lenovo is a world-class maker of personal computers. Xiaomi is one of China's top smartphone brands. Disadvantages. Government spending created a total debt to GDP ratio of 317% as of the first quarter of 2020, the highest on record. This includes debt held by the government, corporations, and consumers. Since the state owns many corporations, it must be included. The consumer debt may have also created an asset bubble. Urban housing prices have skyrocketed as low interest rates fueled speculation. High growth levels have come at the cost of consumer safety. The public has protested pollution, food safety, and inflation. It also created a class of ultra-rich professionals who want more individual liberties. They live in urban areas since that's where most of the jobs are. In 2017, almost 60% of the population lived in urban areas. In the 1980s, it was just 20%. Local governments are charged with providing social services but are constrained in the taxes they can collect to fund them. As a result, families are forced to save. China doesn't offer benefits to people who've moved from the farms to the cities to work. Interest rates have been low, so families don't receive much return on their savings. As a result, they don't spend much. That keeps domestic demand low and slows growth. In most recent times, China has had a death-blowing effect on virtually every country it has relations with, either through investments, trade, and so many others. Let's take a look at the China economic slowdown. It is no longer news that China is facing a recession. The great driver of economic trouble in China has been Xi's zero-COVID policy, which has sent hundreds of millions of people into mandatory lockdowns that have led to food and medicine shortages and a stifling of economic activity. Many factory workers were stuck at home during the worst of the lockdowns, apart from the minority who lived at their facilities. Perpetually shifting closures from even a single nearby case continue to cause production slowdowns. It's worth defining what the 2022 slowdown looks like. Growth estimates are falling monthly, with major banks including Goldman Sachs and Nomura now predicting barely 3% or lower GDP growth for 2022, and the World Bank forecasting a figure of 2.8%. That might be a satisfactory number for many countries. It's an anemic figure for China, down from a jaw-dropping 8.1% last year. And, perhaps more important, nowhere near the government's own forecast of 5.5% for 2022. Add this to a significant drop in imports and exports and the subsequent pressure of the yen, and the much-touted China century is hitting its first major speed bump. The effect and impact of a prolonged China slowdown, and there's little reason to believe this is just a temporary setback, will vary from country to country. Those that have grown dependent on the commodity trade with China are likely to feel the most pain. With much of the world teetering on the cusp of recession, there are still no other major markets for China's high-volume, low-margin exports. Agricultural products, for example. China is the third largest export market for the US behind Canada and Mexico, with $151 billion in goods sold to China last year. Nearly 18% of that figure included fruit, grains, seed, cereals, and meat. The China slowdown is already hitting this year's trade numbers. After years of rapid growth, US exports to China were relatively flat for the first 6 months of 2022 compared to the same period last year. Popular foreign consumer brands including Adidas, Estee Lauder are already revising down their revenue projections. Apple has also seen signs of lowered demand along with Hilton Worldwide Holdings and Moncler. Nike's fiscal 2022 China revenue, which ended in May of this year, saw its first drop after nearly a decade of steady growth. For other major economies, the effects are likely to be more dramatic. Germany's 2021 exports to China made up more than 3% of the country's GDP. And the German mix is overwhelmingly weighted with higher-end manufactured goods, including vehicles and machinery, which would be hard hit by an industrial slowdown. Here too, the pain is already evident. While early 2022 got off to a good start, German exports to China in the latter part of this year were noticeably lower than the same period a year ago. Japan, Hong Kong, South Korea, and Taiwan have been hit even harder, all suffering negative export growth to China in the last few months. China is Japan's top export market, and while sales have remained fairly flat through the first half of 2022, they are running below the same period a year ago. Poorer nations may suffer most. It's hard to overstate the degree to which many developing countries have grown dependent on exports in general, and on exports to China specifically, to fuel their growth. Here too, the 2022 trade numbers tell the slowdown story. China has long been the top export destination for Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, and the number 2 export destination for Thailand, the Philippines, and Vietnam. Nearly all were exporting less to China as of July than a year ago. Malaysia in particular is highly export dependent on China, with sales accounting for more than 12% of its 2021 GDP. While exports continue to grow, China as a percentage of Malaysian overall exports is slowing considerably, outpaced by the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the US, and Singapore. Thailand's exports to China accounted for nearly 6% of its last year's GDP, but growth has turned negative this summer after peaking at 50% growth year over year back in early 2021. The trend is similar for Indonesia, with exports to China representing 5% of its GDP, but on a dramatically downward trend, dropping to 25% growth in mid-2022 from roughly 75% at the same point a year ago. We have come to the end of today's video. What happens if the China slowdown gets worse? Does that bring a prophecy of doom on other economies? How much of a big player do you think China is? Are these effects being overly exaggerated? Do share your thoughts in the comment section. If you like this video, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and tap the bell icon so you can get notifications about any future videos.